What is up, everyone, and welcome to Intellectual Gaming, where gaming equals education. I'm Jason, your host, and today, as it's kind of our inaugural episode of this podcast, I just kind of want to go over a little bit about why video games. Like, why am I creating a show that is all about talking about video games, but not just video games? The purpose here is to talk about video games in much more of a intellectual light or an intellectual standing. Like, I don't want to just talk about, like, oh, what games are good or what games I like or stuff like that, although we will probably be talking a lot about games that I do like. But I want to talk a lot about video games in the sense of studying them the way you would, like, a book or a movie. Like, kind of cracking them open, looking at them, seeing how they connect to things people have studied about and talked about in the past, or what themes or what can you learn from them, or just taking a very scholarly approach to kind of examining video games. And I want to do this because I've had a passion of video games for my entire life. I do have vague memories of playing on my dad's old NES, the original Super Mario Brothers, which is probably the first video game I ever played, I would imagine. Although I really got, excuse me, I really got into gaming when it came to the Super Nintendo. The Super Nintendo I ended up getting for Christmas one year when I was very, very young. And it came with 3 games. And I can still, for whatever reason, vividly remember the games that it came with. It came with the Lion King, which was a game that very, very much frustrated me. There was this one specific level where you have to climb a waterfall, and it was such a pain to figure out, and I've since learned it's actually a lot easier than what my, 5-year-old self, or however old I was making it. But no, it ended up being very challenging for me to constantly get to that level and just never, ever be able to get past it. I also got the Page Master, which, for those of you of my generation, that movie probably brings back some flashbacks. Still wonderful classic, in my opinion. And the game was actually one, too. It's actually the very first game I ever remember really finding cheats for, essentially. Not actually going online and looking them up, although this was around the time where that kind of started being something you could do. But I just ended up, just me and my brothers, when playing through the game, just found random little things you could do, like random doors you could open up that would skip whole levels or get you to new areas. And it was always a lot of fun to just mess around in. Crazy, weird game. I don't really remember it following the movie too much, but of course, it's been years and years and years since I played it. But then the third game that I got was The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past. And A Link to the Past was the one that got me hooked on video games. Hooked on just the adventure, the story I thought was fun, even if it's basic. It was just so much fun to play and to just be this hero, wandering this world and just fighting enemies. And I grew to appreciate it more and more the older I got. But even back when I was younger, I got really, really fascinated with just the world and the concept. And it started my lifelong passion for the Legend of Zelda series, which I would still to this day name The Legend of Zelda is my favorite video game series, but also A Link to the Past is my favorite video game. Really, a lot of it tracing back to this first experience of it really opening my eyes to how incredible video games can actually be. Because you just can explore a whole world, and especially as a kid, when you're confined a lot to just certain spaces for most of your time, that's pretty incredible. But then also one thing I loved about The Legend of Zelda is you actually had to be kind of intelligent to play it. It's full of puzzles, and as I grew older, I realized that I could use that to convince my parents to allow me to play more video games, because I would, especially after I got Ocarina of Time, a few years down the road, I would want to play it, and I would go to my mom and I would talk her into like, well, there's puzzles and you have to use your brain and all this stuff, and I literally would lay out this whole logical argument as to why it was actually good for me to play it, and she would agree. And yeah, so it doing that really started opening my eyes to how video games are more than just like something fun. And they are certainly just like, it's a lot of fun to just sit down and just blast through a game and just have a great time and just, forget about everything else for a while. But there's also so much more to games, because the people who are making them are human beings, just like the people who write novels and who write philosophy and who make movies and music and all this other stuff that is considered artistic and is considered important to culture. And we've always had this mentality, like, when it comes to like books and movies, like, those are culturally important, even though movies are still something that in the span of human history are relatively new and are still technologically based. It's not uncommon to go to prestigious universities and you study film, or whole schools where you study film. And if you cite film as an influence, or talk about how much a film has impacted your life, nobody really will bat an eye about that, because they'll probably come back and be like, oh my god, yeah, this movie, this changed my life. And there's definitely people like that with video games, but culturally it doesn't seem to be on the same level. A lot of the times, if you watch like a sitcom, I'll watch a lot of sitcoms on TV sometimes, and when they portray characters playing video games, and they do this in like movies too, it's considered more of like a childish thing. Like, they're doing it as like an escape. It's kind of like that in How I Met Your Mother, there's the one episode where Marshall's father passes away, and he ends up going to go stay with his mom for a while, on the pretense that he's going to go take care of her, but she ends up taking care of him, and the thing he basically does the whole time is just play video games. And that's just like his escape, but it's also considered like, oh, well, you shouldn't be doing this. Like, it's kind of like regressing. You see the same thing in shows like Big Bang Theory, which does a really good job of like celebrating nerddom as a whole, but the characters' love of video games is called childish by a lot of the other characters a lot of times, and kind of like part of their growth in the show is kind of moving away from that and realizing how childish some of that stuff is. And it doesn't go all the way. It definitely doesn't go so far as to try to really attack that kind of stuff, but it does kind of portray it in this light of, well, if you're sitting around playing video games, you're kind of wasting your life. And no, those are shows I absolutely do love. But I don't necessarily love like the portrayal of games being super childish, because that's not really always the case. And sure, like, there are definitely games where it's like you sit down and really, like, the only point is to just have fun. A lot of old arcade games, although I do think that you could definitely make the case that they're very artistic and would still be considered art. You sit down to play something like Donkey Kong, you're not getting a massive story out of it or anything. Like, you're just having fun. Same with Pac-Man. Even more so with Pac-Man. But there are also plenty of other games like The Legend of Zelda that take you a little bit more in depth and require you to think and require you to problem solve. And there's whole games that are based entirely around problem solving and puzzles, like Portal or the Talos Principle. And so there tends to be a lot more to video games than just, oh yeah, I'm just going to kill time and waste time, because it does really have an effect on you. And playing through games like The Legend of Zelda, and I would later expand out to things like Final Fantasy and Kingdom Hearts and all these that have deeper stories and more exploration, and you kind of start to see how impactful video games can be. They're more than just toys or products. They are actual things that people have built and have put soul into, just like they would their writing or movies or music. And that's something that I think that is important to recognize is people created these games. Like, we read books and we watch movies and we discuss, what the characters are going through and their character arcs and the story and the themes behind it and what the author intended behind their work. And we really do deep dives into these stories. And then when it comes to video games, a lot of people, I feel like, kind of shrug them off. But nothing could be further from the case. You have Ocarina of Time, which is a story that brings in themes of heroism and light versus darkness, and you have this boy who thinks he's a nobody, and he ends up finding out that he's actually destined to be this hero, and he becomes that hero and saves the world. And it has a lot of tropes that you see in a lot of other fantasy, but to me that's really interesting to study is all the tropes that ended up in Ocarina of Time that you can see as patterns throughout all other, fantasy works, basically. Or it's a lot like what Joseph Campbell talked about with his hero cycle. You have games like Metal Gear, which is about patriotism and morality and trying to figure out what is right versus wrong. And especially in Metal Gear Solid 3, you're dealing with things kind of turning on their heads and realizing that, oh, just because you're told something by an authority doesn't make it true. And it deals with, again, the morality of war and who is in the right and wrong and who actually has the power and how are soldiers treated outside of war. You have games like Kingdom Hearts, which are about tragedy and loss and friendship and healing and trying to figure out your way forward even if you lose the people in your life that you care about. Like, all these games have these different themes, and sure, you can find them in plenty of books and movies and probably even like music, pieces of art, but you can also find them in video games, and that shouldn't be discounted because video games have a lot to offer when it comes to that. And there's a lot that you can study and glean from them. There's so much you can delve into, whether it's how Isaac Asimov's works tie into the Nier series, or what works like Joseph Campbell's hero cycle you can see reflected, or, ancient Greek philosophy. You can definitely see things like Kingdom Hearts, and especially Master Xehanort as a character, being very reminiscent of a Greek tragedy. There's references to Shakespeare throughout certain games, and there's games with morality systems where you have to make your own moral choices, and there's just so much that has been added to them because they create these whole worlds. And we live in a world where most, at least on this planet, has been explored. We still have, of course, a lot of ocean that we haven't really delved into, and there's all of outer space. But even if we were living in a world where we were sending people out into other planets and things like that, that's not something, the vast majority of people are going to end up doing. Video games offer a way to explore worlds and universes and ideas and themes, kind of a first-hand experience. Whereas books speak more directly to your mind, video games do give you a visual representation, but a lot of agencies to go through the world. So it's kind of almost like a cross between a movie and a book, because whereas books, you can kind of visualize the world and build it around you, movies do the building for you, and take you down this. They both take you down specific narratives, and in a lot of cases, video games do too. But they also offer you a lot more agency in the world to explore. And that's not, of course, all video games. But how cool is it that there are games where you can explore other planets and other creatures, where you can wander worlds that you have no idea what's around the corner. You have no idea what's in this cave. You have no idea what you're going to find, like, under the caverns or in this forest or whatever. And you can just explore and wander and see what's there. And that's not an experience you get with books or video games. And it's even becoming more realistic with VR and your ability to almost feel like you're really there and you're looking around and you're moving your head, and it's like, wow, it's like you're actually seeing all of this yourself. And I think that can be a really cool experience and really important. It's really impactful, and I think it's impacted a lot of people's lives to be able to just journey and have an adventure yourself. Because like how often have you read a book and pictured yourself as that character or in that environment, and it was like you were transported away and to some other realm or some other land, and you're on this adventure. Like you read The Hobbit, and then it's almost like you're there. You're with them, seeing the singing dwarves and dealing with trolls and fighting dragons. And in video games, you can actually do that. You can actually explore the world. You can actually put your team together. You can actually fight dragons. And it just adds this whole other layer. And it definitely does not replace books or movies. Both mediums I absolutely love. I am a huge reader, and I'm a big movie buff. So I definitely would never discount those. It just offers a different experience and a different way to explore a world and explore a story. But it's not even just exploring stories that you can do in video games. Some, like I mentioned, like Portal, are there is a bit of a story, but it's very much more puzzle based. It's about just exercising your mind. It's about looking around you and figuring out how to move from point A to point B, or how to open a door. And it's just a lot of little puzzles that just exercise your mind, but it's fun. Like I love Portal. I really loved Portal too. The Talos Principle is another one that most of the game is really just based around puzzles, and it can just be so impressive to go through and just like you get a sense of achievement if there's a puzzle that is really taking it. You're having to take your time with it. You're struggling, but when you finally figure out that solution, it feels so good. And that's another just fun aspect of video games, is they offer that sense of achievement. And as tough as the world can be sometimes, it can be kind of nice to spend a bit of time on something and figure out how to progress to the next level or the next stage or solve this next puzzle. Video games just offer a sense of accomplishment and achievement, and there's a lot of different ways that they can help you just feel good or feel better or exercise your mind. And it's just like really cool how versatile video games really can be. But they are also just like very visually stimulating. Like in a lot of ways, video games are really a great example of art. And I know there's always been this debate about, are video games really art? Are they not? I do like that we are drifting more into accepting video games as art. I think it was the Metropolitan Museum of Art, I think, that had a exhibit a few years ago, and I think it's a permanent exhibit, but it houses video games as art, and it has a few different examples, and I think some playable demos to really showcase it. But it's like a standing exhibit in a well-respected art museum that is all about showing video games as art. And I think that's really cool, because you play video games and you can definitely see that they're very artistic and in a lot of different ways. You have the very obvious like visual artistic representation, which is, you can go from obvious examples like Elden Ring and Shadow of the Colossus, which are very beautiful, well-crafted excuse me, worlds that have just some really artistic areas. We're talking like beautiful skies and forests, and it looks just like these amazing worlds. But then I do think you can go back to like the older styles, like the pixel art from like the arcades and the NES, or the 16-bit art from like the Super Nintendo. And I think there's a lot of artistic, flair there too. There's a lot of really interesting design choices. I think certain things like the original Super Mario Brothers or original Legend of Zelda, I think are very iconic looks. That, you see Super Mario from the original game and you know exactly what it is and where it's from, even if you've never played that game before. But I think that style can also just show like a completely different sort of artistic representation, because instead of like these big open worlds, you're working, to do a lot with the little that you have. It's kind of like in Super Mario Brothers, how the bushes and the clouds were the exact same sprite. They were just like flipped and recolored. But if you look at them, you can actually tell that they are definitely the exact same sprite. And it's just like cool to see what people could do when they were so limited, and the worlds that they could craft and the designs that they could make. And it just, in a day and age where everything is so big and elaborate, it's kind of cool to see like what human beings can still craft when they have a serious set of limitations on them and on what they can do. And it's just like really cool. But there's a lot more to the way video games can express themselves artistically. There's games such as Journey or Disco Elysium, which are very artistic in their own right, just in terms of style, but also in terms of gameplay. They are just very different. Same with Ico, where it uses its gameplay as part of the story itself. It's like Ico is basically one big escort mission, but it actually manages to pull it off really well, especially, given how unpopular a lot of escort missions tend to be in video games, because of how annoying they can be at times. But it's neat to see how video games can express themselves in so many different ways, and even use the controls themselves as a way to hinder or help you, or just express a different message. And that's not something you can get from books or movies or music. It's an entirely different experience. And it just shows how video games as a medium are very unique and shouldn't go anywhere, because you can express stories and ideas and concepts in a way that you can't really do with books or movies. Again, definitely not a replacement for any other medium, but it's just a different way of being able to express certain things that you couldn't do in, a book or a movie. One of my favorite examples of storytelling that can only be done through a video game, the way it's being done, is in Nier Replicant. So you go through that game, and this will be spoilers for Nier if you haven't played it. And I would highly recommend playing it if you haven't. But you go through the game, and you're fighting these shadows. And the whole game you're fighting these shadows, and they yell at you in like these grunts and these yells, and it almost is like a language, but they're like monsters that have plagued humanity for a long time, and so you don't have any problem trying to kill them. They've been trying to kill you. So you go through, you get to the end of the game, and then it starts you back about midway through the game, and you replay essentially the second half of the game again. But what it does is going through the second half, it unlocks that language that the shadows were speaking in. So now all of a sudden you can see what they were saying. And it turns out that they're actually very peaceful, and they will not, they're not actually out to kill the humans. And it turns out when you're attacking them, they're actually usually begging you to stop. There's one point where you mass slaughter their children, and you thought they were enemies attacking you, but they were actually more like babies. The wolves that you thought were attacking you, that were shadows, it turns out that they were actually just scared, and that the humans had been attacking them first, and they were just trying to retaliate because they're scared and they're being hurt and they're being killed. One monster you fought that you thought was trying to kill this man, it turns out she actually really cared about him and was trying to protect him, and you guys killed her because you didn't realize she wasn't a monster, because she just looked like one. So you go through the entire game once, and then you go through it again, and you're replaying the same events, and the only detail that's really changed is the language you can now understand, and then all of a sudden just recontextualizes the entire story. And that's not something you can get in a video game or a movie. And even to take it a step further, because if you're playing through, and this is even on the first playthrough, if you just go up to shadows and stand near them, they actually do not attack you. They will not try to harm you until after you have harmed them. So it's just another cool detail that can only really happen in a video game, because in a movie, everything's already laid out. And, you see what you see, because everything is filmed and very deliberate. Books, same thing. Like they'll just straight up tell you, and you can sprinkle hints and things in a book, but with this video game, like you can easily, right from the very beginning, start to piece things together, even going so far as to just sit there and watch as the shadows do not even try to harm you until after you, make the first attack. But I don't know, it's interesting to see this sort of unique way of storytelling that can only happen in a video game. And so when I call video games artistic, that's exactly the kind of thing that I am talking about. There's definitely the visual aspect, but there's so much more, and they're just so cool to be able to just play some of these games and see what people have come up with in order to try to tell their story. And then, of course, you can't leave out the fact that video games are a lot of fun, which I think are important. I think humans are supposed to have fun, and they're supposed to enjoy their life. And video games, to me, that's always been a very, very personal thing for me, because I've used them throughout my life during very hard times in my life where, I could use them as a sort of escape to just relax and just refocus and kind of get my mind back together. And growing up, we played video games a lot in my household, and some of my fondest memories were playing games with my siblings. And we would, we'd play Mario Kart. We would play Smash Brothers. We still play Smash Brothers a lot, but we played a lot on the original Smash Brothers, and then later on Melee. We did F-Zero on the GameCube. We would play Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles and Four Sword Adventures. Games that who knows who is playing any of those today. But yeah, like they would bring us together. When we got a Wii, like we would have all these family get-togethers, and even my grandparents would join in on the Wii bowling. My parents would be bowling right alongside us. My dad was often the one who would start off getting it set up. Yeah, so it's just it brought our family together, and it offered just like a lot of joy and a lot of peace in times when when things got hard. And yeah, there's just a lot of value, I think, there to the fun aspect of video games, and that just ties into everything else, which is how important video games are and why they matter to me. And so that's kind of the purpose of the show, is just, begin having more serious conversations about the good video games add to the world, and, examining them the same way you would a book or a movie. So that way, hopefully, we'll get to the point where people, you can feel free to cite, a game just like you would a movie or a book when you're writing something important, and just to get your point across, and people respect that rather than think that you're being a child for referencing a video game. So yeah, we'll see how this goes. I'm pretty new at this, and it's probably going to evolve over time, so we'll see. But yeah, definitely subscribe, follow, like if you're on like YouTube, if you enjoy these sorts of shows and just kind of are interested in some of the stuff I'm going to be talking about. If you're interested in supporting us, I do have a Patreon set up. Right now, it's really just to help support and grow this into something bigger, and help me transition to be able to do this more full time. So there's nothing super crazy. Eventually, I hope to have like tiers, and I'll probably hopefully add some stuff to them. But right now, do not feel obligated. Just if you feel like you like these and you kind of want to help support, make this bigger and enjoy these conversations. And yeah, we will see you next time. But happy studying, everyone, and have a good day.